Welcome to G-Fun Facts Online, the show where we dive deep into the fascinating stories behind the world we live in. Today, we're talking about a law. Now, I know what you're thinking, a law? How exciting can that be? But trust me, this isn't just any law. This is a law born in the fire of World War I that has been used to prosecute spies, silence dissenters, and in our modern age, has become the government's go-to weapon against some of the most famous and infamous names of the 21st century. Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, reality winner. We are talking about the Espionage Act of 1917. For over a century, this single piece of legislation has been at the center of a furious debate about the very soul of America, the constant epic struggle between national security and personal freedom, between government secrecy and the public's right to know. So how did a wartime law, meant to catch German spies, become a tool used against whistleblowers leaking information on the internet? Let's find out. To understand the Espionage Act, we have to go back to 1917. The Great War, what we now call World War I, had been raging in Europe for 3 years. America, under President Woodrow Wilson, had tried desperately to stay out of it. Wilson even won re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But staying neutral was getting harder and harder. Public sympathy was largely with Britain and France. Then came the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania by a German U-boat, killing 128 Americans. The final straw was the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany to Mexico, basically saying, hey, if you attack the US, we'll help you get back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The American public was outraged. On April 6, 1917, the United States officially declared war on Germany. President Wilson knew that going to war wasn't just about sending soldiers overseas. It was about uniting a divided country. He warned that disloyalty would be met with a firm hand of repression. And to make sure everyone got on board, the government created something called the Committee on Public Information, or CPI. Headed by a journalist named George Creel, the CPI was essentially a massive, state-sponsored propaganda machine. They churned out posters, pamphlets, and films, all designed to whip up patriotism and support for the war. They even had an army of 75,000 volunteers called the 4-Minute Men, who would give short, pro-war speeches in public places like movie theaters. This campaign was incredibly effective, but it also created an atmosphere of intense fear and intolerance. Anything that smelled like anti-war sentiment was seen as disloyal, even treacherous. It was in this climate of supercharged nationalism that Congress passed the Espionage Act on June 15, 1917. On the surface, its goal was simple: stop spies and prevent people from interfering with the military. But its language was incredibly broad and powerful. The act made it a crime to obtain or share any information related to national defense if you had reason to believe it could be used to injure the United States. It also criminalized making false statements to interfere with the military, or doing anything to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the armed forces. And perhaps most critically, it made it illegal to willfully obstruct the military draft. The penalties were severe, up to 20 years in prison, and a fine of $10,000. That's over $200,000 in today's money. The act was a legal sledgehammer. And notice that vague term, national defense. The law never actually defined what that meant, leaving it wide open for the government to interpret however it wanted. It also gave the Postmaster General the power to declare any newspaper or magazine non-mailable if it violated the act. This was a huge deal. The post office was the internet of its day, and Postmaster General Albert Burleson used this power like a weapon, effectively shutting down dozens of socialist and anti-war publications. A year later, in 1918, things got even more extreme with the Sedition Act, an amendment that made it illegal to say, write, or publish anything disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive about the U.S. government, the Constitution, or the flag. With these laws in hand, the Wilson administration went on the hunt, prosecuting over 2,000 people. This is where the law first truly showed its teeth, leading to some of the most important free speech cases in American history. One of the first major targets was a man named Charles Schenck. He was the General Secretary of the Socialist Party, and he was arrested for distributing 15,000 leaflets that called the draft a form of slavery and urged men to resist it. He was convicted under the Espionage Act, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. In the famous 1919 decision, Clockley, Schenck versus United States, the court upheld his conviction. It was here that Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote one of the most famous phrases in legal history. He said that the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech is not absolute. In his words, the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. He argued that when speech creates a clear and present danger of causing the harm that Congress is trying to prevent, that speech can be punished. This clear and present danger test became the standard for decades. Another famous case was that of Eugene V. Debs, a prominent labor leader and five-time Socialist Party candidate for president. He gave a speech in Ohio where he criticized the war and the Espionage Act itself. For that, he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. He famously ran his 1920 presidential campaign from his prison cell, getting nearly 1 million votes. The Supreme Court upheld his conviction too. These cases solidified the government's power to clamp down on speech during wartime, but they also sparked a backlash. Justice Holmes himself seemed to have second thoughts. In another case that same year, Nybrams versus United States, he wrote a powerful dissent, arguing for a more robust protection of speech. He introduced the idea of the marketplace of ideas, the concept that the best way to find truth is to allow all ideas, even those we hate, to compete freely. The controversy also led directly to the creation of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, which formed to defend the rights of people being prosecuted under these acts. The Sedition Act was repealed in 1920, but the core of the Espionage Act remained law. For the next few decades, through World War II and the Cold War, the act was used more in the way you'd expect, to prosecute actual spies. The most notorious case was that of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were convicted of passing atomic bomb secrets to the Soviet Union and were executed in 1953. But in the 1970s, the act's target began to change. It started being used not just against foreign agents, but against American government insiders who leaked classified information to the press. This brought the Espionage Act into a direct collision course with the First Amendment's protection of a free press. The pivotal moment was the case of Daniel Ellsberg. In 1971, Ellsberg, a former military analyst, leaked a massive, top-secret study on the history of the Vietnam War to the New York Times. These documents became known as the Pentagon Papers, and they revealed that multiple presidential administrations had systematically lied to the American public about the war. The Nixon administration went to court to try and stop the papers from being published, but in a landmark decision, New York Times Company versus United States, the Supreme Court sided with the press, setting a very high bar for the government to censor news. Nixon wasn't done though. He also charged Ellsberg himself under the Espionage Act. If convicted, he faced over 100 years in prison. But the case against him spectacularly fell apart when it was revealed that the White House had engaged in illegal wiretaps and even broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office looking for dirt on him. The judge dismissed all charges. The Ellsberg case was a watershed moment. It showed that the Espionage Act could be used to punish a whistleblower for exposing government lies, raising profound questions about the public's right to know what its government is really doing. And that brings us to the digital age. The rise of the internet and organizations like WikiLeaks has supercharged this debate. In recent years, the Espionage Act has been used more frequently against leakers than ever before. Let's look at the big three. First, Chelsea Manning, a former Army intelligence analyst. In 2010, she leaked hundreds of thousands of classified documents to WikiLeaks, including battlefield reports from Iraq and Afghanistan and diplomatic cables. These leaks exposed potential war crimes, civilian casualties, and torture. She was convicted under the Espionage Act and sentenced to 35 years, though her sentence was later commuted by President Obama. Then there's Edward Snowden. In 2013, the former NSA contractor leaked a treasure trove of documents revealing the shocking extent of global surveillance programs run by the US government, programs that were collecting data on millions of ordinary people around the world. He too was charged under the Espionage Act and, to avoid prosecution, now lives in exile in Russia. And finally, Reality Winner, a former Air Force linguist. In 2017, she leaked a single classified report to the news outlet The Intercept about Russian attempts to hack into US voting systems before the 2016 election. She was convicted and received the longest sentence ever given by a federal court for a leak to the media, 5 years and 3 months in prison. Civil liberties groups and press freedom advocates are horrified by these cases. They argue that the Espionage Act, a relic from World War I, is being used as a blunt instrument to silence whistleblowers and intimidate journalists. Their biggest criticism is that the act has no public interest defense. A person charged under it, like Snowden or Manning, cannot stand up in court and argue that their actions were justified because they informed the public about serious government misconduct. Under the law, the motive doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is whether you disclose national defense information without authorization. On the other side, government prosecutors and national security officials argue that these leaks, no matter the motive, cause grave damage. They say it compromises intelligence sources, endangers troops, and makes it harder for diplomats to do their jobs. For them, the law is a necessary tool to hold people accountable who have sworn an oath to protect classified information. So here we are, over 100 years later. The Espionage Act of 1917 is more relevant and more controversial than ever. Its story is a journey from a law meant to stop spies and anti-war activists to a primary tool used in the modern information war against whistleblowers. It forces us to confront a fundamental dilemma. How do we, as a society, balance the government's need for secrecy with the public's right to know? Where is the line between an act of espionage that harms the country and an act of whistleblowing that serves it? As technology continues to blur the lines between journalism, activism, and leaking, this century-old law will remain at the heart of the debate over security and liberty. The story of the Espionage Act is still being written, in courtrooms, in newsrooms, and in the choices we all make about the kind of government we want to have. Thanks for tuning in to G Fun Facts Online. Well, see you next time.